Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The year is 1945. Europe is a landscape of ghosts and rubble, a continent slowly waking from the fever dream of war. In the Netherlands, amid the relief of liberation, there is a reckoning. Collaborators are being hunted, their treasons exposed to the harsh light of a new day. And in Amsterdam, a man named Han van Meegeren, a painter of some minor renown, finds himself in a cold interrogation room, facing the most serious charge imaginable, aiding the enemy. The evidence against him is damning. Allied officers, the famed monuments men tasked with recovering the continent's stolen art, have been meticulously tracing the lineage of treasures looted by the Nazi elite. Their search led them to a salt mine in Altaussee, Austria, a subterranean vault containing thousands of priceless works. Among them, they found a stunning painting titled The Woman Taken in Adultery, a previously unknown masterpiece by the Dutch master, Johannes Vermeer. The painting had been the crown jewel in the collection of none other than Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, and the sales records, tragically clear, showed that this piece of Dutch national heritage had been sold to the Nazi leader in the midst of a brutal occupation by one man, Han van Meegeren. The crime was collaboration of the highest order. Selling a cultural treasure to the enemy was not just illegal, it was a profound betrayal of a nation that had suffered immensely under Nazi rule. The penalty was severe, likely death. Van Meegeren was cornered, his fate seemingly sealed by Göring's own meticulous bookkeeping. For 6 weeks, he languished in prison, denying everything, his protests falling on deaf ears. The proof was irrefutable. And then, on May 29, 1945, Henricus van Meegeren, facing the abyss, made a confession. It was a statement so bizarre, so audacious, that his interrogators could scarcely believe it. He claimed he was innocent of collaboration. He insisted he had not sold a priceless Vermeer to the Nazis. Why? Because the painting was not a Vermeer. It was a fake. He knew this for a fact, he told them, because he was the one who had painted it. To save himself from the gallows, this seemingly ordinary artist had to prove he was, in fact, one of the most brilliant criminals of the century. He had to convince the world that he was a liar, a charlatan, and a master forger. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a perfect forgery. We explore not a crime of passion or violence, but a crime of intellect, chemistry, and revenge. We will trace the intricate methods of a man who weaponized art history, who reverse-engineered the genius of a Dutch master, and who concocted a chemical formula that could mimic the passage of 300 years. This is the story of how an artist's burning resentment for the establishment that rejected him culminated in a swindle so magnificent it fooled the world's leading experts, enriched the artist beyond his wildest dreams, and ultimately made a fool of the Nazi regime itself. To understand the crime, you must first understand the man. Henricus Antonius van Meegeren was born in 1889 in the provincial Dutch city of Deventer. He was not, from the outset, a criminal mastermind. He was a sensitive boy with a clear and undeniable talent for drawing, a passion that was met with the cold, unyielding disapproval of his father. Henricus van Meegeren, a stern history teacher, saw art as a frivolous and decadent pursuit. He held a rigid, authoritarian view of life and education, and he subjected his son to a constant barrage of criticism. It's said that he would frequently tear up the young Han's drawings, telling him, "You are a cheat, a liar, a fake." These words, meant to crush a boy's spirit, would echo with a profound irony decades later. Despite this discouragement, Van Meegeren's talent could not be entirely suppressed. He found a mentor in the teacher and painter Bartus Korteling, who saw the boy's potential and schooled him in the traditional techniques of the Dutch Golden Age painters. Korteling taught him how to mix his own paints, how to prepare his canvases, how to understand the chemistry of color and the physics of light. It was a classical, almost archaic education, one that instilled in Van Meegeren a deep reverence for the craft of masters like Rembrandt, Frans Hals, and, above all, Johannes Vermeer. He enrolled at the Delft University of Technology to study architecture, a compromise to appease his father. But art remained his true calling. He excelled, winning a prestigious gold medal for a drawing of a church interior, a piece executed with the meticulous precision of a 17th century master. This early success was a validation, a sign that his traditionalist path was the correct one. He abandoned architecture and dedicated himself to painting, moving to The Hague and immersing himself in its vibrant art scene. For a time, he found success. He became a fashionable portraitist, commanding high fees from the Dutch elite. His works were technically proficient, and he was known for his ability to capture a likeness. But this commercial success did not translate into critical acclaim. By the 1920s, the art world was in the throes of modernism. Cubism, surrealism, and abstraction were the movements capturing the imagination of critics and collectors. Van Meegeren's style, rooted in the 17th century, was seen as derivative, uninspired, and hopelessly old-fashioned. The critics were merciless. They dismissed his work as sterile imitation, accusing him of lacking originality and vision. One particularly scathing review labeled him a gifted technician who has all the virtues except originality. For a man with an ego as large and fragile as Van Meegeren's, these words were poison. He developed a festering resentment, a deep-seated hatred for the art establishment. The critics, the museum curators, the academics, who he believed were too blind, too obsessed with fleeting trends to recognize his genius. He saw them as frauds, promoting meaningless art while ignoring true craftsmanship. And in the crucible of this bitterness, a plan began to form. It was a plan for revenge, a revenge so total and so humiliating that it would expose the entire art world as a sham. He would not just paint a good copy, he would create a new masterpiece. He would forge a painting so perfect, so utterly convincing, that the very experts who had scorned him would be forced to declare it a work of genius. He would make them his unwitting accomplices in the greatest art fraud in history. The target for his grand deception had to be chosen with surgical precision. It couldn't be just any artist. It had to be a master whose work was exceedingly rare, immensely valuable, and imperfectly understood. The choice was almost obvious: Johannes Vermeer of Delft. Vermeer was the perfect mark. In the early 20th century, he was experiencing a massive revival in popularity. After centuries of relative obscurity, he was now hailed as one of the titans of the Dutch Golden Age, a master of light and domestic intimacy. Yet, his known body of work was incredibly small, with only around 35 paintings definitively attributed to him. This rarity made any potential new discovery a monumental event in the art world. Crucially, there were gaps in Vermeer's biography. His early life and influences were a subject of intense academic debate. Scholars theorized about a possible Italian period, speculating that Vermeer may have been influenced by the dramatic religious scenes of Caravaggio before developing his signature style of serene domestic interiors. This scholarly void was the door Van Meegeren planned to walk through. He wouldn't forge another girl with a pearl earring or a milkmaid in a kitchen. That would be too easily compared to existing works. Instead, he would create a painting from Vermeer's lost early period. He would invent a history. He chose a religious theme, a subject matter that would fit the Italian influence theory perfectly. The scene would be the supper at Emmaus, depicting the moment when two of Christ's disciples recognized their resurrected Savior. It was a subject painted by Caravaggio himself, lending credence to the historical narrative he was constructing. It was ambitious, a large-scale, multi-figure composition, entirely different from anything in Vermeer's accepted oeuvre, yet just plausible enough to be tantalizing. With his target and subject selected, Van Meegeren dedicated himself to the anatomy of the forgery, with the obsessive focus of a research scientist. This was not merely about painting in the style of Vermeer. It was about recreating a 300-year-old physical object. Every single component had to be perfect, capable of withstanding the scrutiny of historians and, eventually, scientific analysis. First, the canvas. A modern canvas would be an instant giveaway. He needed a genuine 17th century canvas. He scoured art dealers and flea markets, buying up worthless, low-quality paintings from the period. He found a large painting of the raising of Lazarus by an unknown artist. The canvas was the right age, the right weave. He painstakingly scraped and dissolved the old paint, being careful not to damage the underlying fabric, leaving him with a beautifully aged, authentic foundation for his new masterpiece. Next were the pigments. This was where his classical training became invaluable. He knew that 17th century painters ground their own colors from natural minerals. He refused to use any modern, factory-made tube paints. He acquired the raw materials, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, to create the brilliant, astronomically expensive ultramarine blue that was a hallmark of Vermeer's palette. White lead, ochres from the earth. He ground them by hand with a mortar and pestle, just as an apprentice in Vermeer's studio would have done. But the greatest challenge, the true secret to his forgery, lay in the binder, the oil that holds the pigment together. Oil paint takes centuries to fully harden or petrify. Fresh oil paint remains soft for decades and would instantly dissolve if tested with a solvent like alcohol or turpentine. Any expert examining a newly discovered 17th century painting would perform this simple test. A single dab with a cotton swab would expose a modern fake. Van Meegeren spent years experimenting, searching for a way to create paint that was hard and brittle, to perfectly mimic the passage of 3 centuries. After countless failed attempts, he found his alchemical solution. It was not a substance from the art world, but from the world of modern industry. Phenyl formaldehyde, better known by its trade name, bakelite. It was one of the first synthetic plastics. Van Meegeren discovered that if he mixed this plastic resin with his hand-ground pigments and oil of lilac as a medium, he could create a paint that, when baked in an oven at a precise temperature, would harden into an insoluble, rock-hard surface. The heat would evaporate the volatile components, and the bakelite would polymerize, creating a film that was completely resistant to solvents. He had chemically created old age. The final touch was the craquelure, the fine network of cracks that appears on old paintings as the paint layers shrink and become brittle. A forgery often has cracks that look unnatural, or cracks that are only in the surface varnish. Van Meegeren needed the cracks to run deep into the paint itself. After baking his painting, he would roll it over a cylinder or pipe, carefully forcing the hardened paint layer to fracture in a pattern consistent with natural aging. Then, he would painstakingly rub black India ink into these tiny fissures to simulate the accumulated dirt of centuries. It was the masterful final step in a process of profound deception. He moved to the French Riviera, away from the prying eyes of the Dutch art scene, and for 6 months in 1936 and 1937, he labored in secret. He channeled everything he knew, all his skill, all his resentment, onto that 17th century canvas. He painted his Christ, his disciples, infusing the scene with a pensive, somber quality. He deliberately included stylistic elements that would appeal to the leading Vermeer scholar of the day, Dr. Abraham Bredius. The faces had a certain sentimental, almost modern quality to them. A subtle flaw that, ironically, would later be one of the keys to his undoing. But for now, it was finished. The supper at Emmaus was complete. It was a masterpiece of forgery, ready to be unleashed upon the world. With the painting complete, the second act of the deception began, creating a believable story for its discovery. Van Meegeren knew he couldn't simply appear with a long-lost Vermeer. He needed a plausible provenance, a chain of ownership that would lend the painting an air of authenticity. He was as meticulous in crafting this narrative as he had been in crafting the painting itself. He invented a story about an old Dutch family living in Italy who had fallen on hard times and were forced to sell their hidden heirlooms. The painting, he claimed, had been in their family for generations, unrecognized for what it truly was. To execute this part of the plan, he needed a middleman, an unwitting pawn who could present the painting without arousing suspicion. He approached a lawyer and member of the Dutch Parliament named Gerard A. Boon. Van Meegeren told Boon that a client of his, a Signora M., wanted to sell the painting anonymously to avoid Italian export taxes and complex family disputes. Boon, intrigued and seeing a potential commission, agreed to represent the seller. He was the perfect intermediary, respectable, connected, and completely unaware that he was part of a criminal enterprise. In the summer of 1937, Boon took the painting to the one man whose opinion mattered more than any other, Dr. Abraham Bredius. Bredius was 83 years old, the undisputed doyen of Dutch art history. He was a scholar of immense reputation, a man who had dedicated his life to the study of the Golden Age masters. His word could make or break a career, and his authentication could instantly add millions to the value of a painting. He was also a man with a particular academic theory, the theory that Vermeer had an early religious period influenced by the Italian masters. He was, in essence, the perfect audience for Van Meegeren's creation. He was predisposed to believe in exactly what he was about to see. The meeting was set. Boon brought the painting to Bredius's home in Monaco. The elderly scholar, his eyesight failing but his confidence unshaken, examined the work. He saw the coarse 17th century canvas. He saw the characteristic points of light, the pointillés, that Vermeer used. He saw the ultramarine blue and the leaden yellow. Most importantly, he saw a religious scene that perfectly confirmed his own long-held theories about Vermeer's early career. It was a spectacular case of confirmation bias. The painting was not just a Vermeer. It was the Vermeer he had been searching for his entire life. Bredius was overcome with emotion. He reportedly had tears in his eyes as he examined the work. He subjected it to a few rudimentary tests, tapping the hard surface, checking the old, cracked varnish. He did not, however, perform a chemical analysis. His expert eye was enough. In September 1937, he published a triumphant article in the prestigious Burlington magazine for connoisseurs, one of the world's leading art journals. His words were unequivocal. He wrote, "It is a wonderful moment in the life of a lover of art when he finds himself suddenly confronted with a hitherto unknown painting by a great master, untouched, on the original canvas, and without any restoration, just as it left the painter's studio." He declared it the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft, praising its feeling and expression, and concluding that it was entirely different from all his other paintings, and yet every inch of Vermeer. This was the ultimate validation. With Bredius's blessing, any lingering doubts were swept away. The art world was electrified. Here was not just a new Vermeer, but the missing link in his career, a window into his formative years. Van Meegeren, watching from the shadows, must have felt a surge of triumphant, vindictive glee. The man who had been dismissed as a mere technician was now, anonymously, being celebrated for creating the masterpiece of the century. The trap had been sprung. The authentication by Bredius triggered a frenzy. The most prestigious museums in the Netherlands vied for the chance to acquire this monumental discovery. A consortium led by the Rembrandt Society purchased the painting for the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam for the staggering sum of 520,000 guilders, equivalent to many millions of dollars today. The painting was hailed as a national treasure, drawing huge crowds who marveled at this powerful, emotive work from the master of Delft. For Han van Meegeren, the financial windfall was immense. After paying off his intermediaries, he was left with a fortune. He bought a lavish 12-bedroom estate in Nice, France, and began to live a life of incredible luxury. But the money was almost secondary. The true reward was the success of his revenge. He had proven his point in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had fooled them all. The critics who had mocked him, the experts who had dismissed him, they were now celebrating his work, writing scholarly articles about his brushstrokes, his composition, his genius. And once you have a foolproof formula for success, why stop? The Emmaus forgery had established a new, accepted chapter in Vermeer's life. Van Meegeren now had a template. Over the next several years, he produced a series of other early Vermeers with religious or mythological themes, including Isaac blessing Jacob and The Last Supper. He also forged works by Peter de Hooch, another popular 17th century Dutch artist. His process became more streamlined. He developed a network of unsuspecting dealers and agents to sell the works, always using elaborate stories of hidden family collections to explain their sudden appearance. Each sale brought more wealth and more validation. He was no longer just an artist. He was the secret puppet master of the Dutch art market. He moved back to the Netherlands, living openly as a wealthy man, his fortune attributed to shrewd art dealing and successful investments. No one suspected that his wealth came not from selling art, but from manufacturing it. Then, in May of 1940, the world changed. The German army invaded the Netherlands, and the country was plunged into the darkness of Nazi occupation. For most, this was a time of fear, deprivation, and terror. For Han van Meegeren, it presented a new and deeply dangerous opportunity. The Nazi elite, particularly Hermann Göring, were voracious and systematic art plunderers. Göring was building a colossal private collection, much of it stolen from Jewish families and occupied territories. He had a particular obsession with the old masters, and Vermeer was high on his list of coveted artists. Van Meegeren, with his unique ability to produce Vermeers on demand, was perfectly positioned to capitalize on this rapacious market. Through his network of dealers, word reached Goring's agents that another spectacular, undiscovered Vermeer was available. This painting was The Woman Taken in Adultery, a work that Van Meegeren had painted specifically with this new clientele in mind. The negotiations were complex, but a deal was struck. Goring was so desperate to acquire the painting that he traded 137 other looted artworks for it, and paid a substantial sum of 1.65 million guilders. It was one of the most expensive art transactions of the war. The painting was delivered to Carenhall, Goring's sprawling forest estate, where it became the centerpiece of his collection. For Van Meegeren, this was the pinnacle of his fraudulent career. He had not only fooled the world's most respected art historians, but he had now swindled the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. He had exchanged a painting that cost him perhaps a few hundred guilders in materials for a king's ransom. It was an act of immense audacity, a private joke played on a genocidal regime. But it was a joke that would have dire consequences. By selling to Goring, Van Meegeren had crossed a line. He was no longer just a brilliant forger. He was now, in the eyes of the law, a man who had sold off a piece of his country's soul to its oppressors. He had created a masterpiece of deception, and that masterpiece was now hanging on a Nazi's wall. When the war ended and the Allies began their meticulous inventory of looted art, the paper trail for The Woman Taken in Adultery would lead them directly and unforgivingly to his door. In the spring of 1945, with the war in Europe over, the Allied Art Commission began its monumental task. Captain Harry Anderson and other officers, part of the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, followed a lead to the salt mines near Altaussee, Austria. There, they uncovered the vast repository of art stolen by the Nazis. As they catalogued the treasures, they found Hermann Göring's prized Vermeer, The Woman Taken in Adultery. Göring's records were notoriously detailed. Working backward, the investigators traced the painting's path. From Göring, it led to his dealer, Walter Andreas Hofer. Hofer's records led to a string of intermediaries in the occupied Netherlands, and at the end of that chain, they found the name of the original seller, Han van Meegeren. On May 29, 1945, 2 Dutch officers arrived at Van Meegeren's grand house on Amsterdam's Keizersgracht Canal. They arrested him on charges of collaboration and fraud. The initial accusation was that he had knowingly sold a Dutch national treasure to the enemy. This was treason. Van Meegeren was taken to prison, where he found himself in a truly unique and terrifying predicament. For weeks he denied the charge. He played the part of the savvy art dealer who had merely facilitated a sale, but the evidence was overwhelming. The investigators, led by a Dutch official named Joseph Pillar, were convinced of his guilt. The prospect of a long prison sentence, or even execution, loomed. Van Meegeren was trapped by his own genius. His forgeries were so perfect that no one believed they were forgeries. His story of a hidden Italian collection was so well crafted that the authorities accepted it as fact. The very success of his deception was now about to cost him his life. He realized he had only one way out. He had to trade one crime for another. Collaboration was a capital offense, but art forgery and fraud carried a much lighter sentence. His only defense was the truth, a truth so outlandish that it seemed like a desperate fiction. After 6 weeks of interrogation, he broke his silence. He called Pillar to his cell and confessed. "The painting in Goring's collection is not, as you think, a Vermeer of Delft," he announced, "but a Van Meegeren. I painted the picture." The investigators were stunned and deeply skeptical. Pillar and his team initially believed it was a desperate, pathetic lie to escape the hangman's noose. Van Meegeren claimed he had not only painted Goring's Vermeer, but also the famous supper at Emmaus, the pride of the Boymans Museum, and several other masterpieces. To the Dutch authorities, this was absurd. The greatest art experts in the world had authenticated these works. They were celebrated national treasures. The idea that they were all the product of this one, somewhat mediocre artist was simply unbelievable. Van Meegeren grew frustrated. "You think I'm lying?" he asked his captors. To prove his point, he began to casually sketch out the intricate chemical processes he used, detailing his use of bakelite, his method for creating craquelure, the specific 17th century pigments he sourced. He explained the entire anatomy of his forgery. The details were so specific, so technically complex, that the investigators began to wonder if there might be a sliver of truth in his story. The Dutch public, learning of the case, was enthralled. The story shifted overnight. Van Meegeren, the suspected Nazi collaborator, was suddenly being recast as a cunning patriot, a trickster who had brilliantly swindled the high command of the Third Reich. He was the man who had traded a worthless fake for 137 genuine Dutch paintings that Goring had looted, effectively repatriating them through an act of criminal genius. Public opinion began to swing dramatically in his favor. But public opinion wouldn't decide the case. The court needed proof. To establish his credibility, Van Meegeren agreed, under police guard, to paint one more forgery. From July to November 1945, in a highly publicized event, he set to work on his final masterpiece. He chose as his subject Jesus among the doctors, another plausible theme for Vermeer's lost religious period. Journalists and court-appointed witnesses watched as he mixed his special bakelite-laced paints, baked the canvas in an oven, and created the ancient-looking cracks. While Van Meegeren painted, an international commission of experts was assembled to conduct a thorough scientific examination of the alleged forgeries. Led by the Belgian chemist Dr. Paul Cormans, the team brought the full force of modern science to bear on the paintings. They took microscopic samples of the paint from the supper at Emmaus and the woman taken in adultery. The analysis was painstaking. They identified the hand-ground pigments, just as Van Meegeren had described, but the decisive breakthrough came when they analyzed the paint's binder. Under the microscope, they found a clear, hard substance that did not behave like centuries-old, petrified oil. When they heated a sample, it gave off the unmistakable smell of formaldehyde. Further chemical tests confirmed it. The binder was phenol formaldehyde. It was bakelite, the hardened synthetic resin Van Meegeren had confessed to using. It was a material that had not been invented until the early 20th century. The science was irrefutable. The paintings were modern forgeries. The Commission's final report methodically deconstructed the anatomy of the fraud, from the anachronistic chemicals to the artificially created craquelure, which, under a microscope, looked completely different from the natural, agerolated cracking on genuine Vermeers. They even found traces of cobalt blue, a pigment not available in the 17th century. The experts who had once praised the paintings were left humiliated. Dr. Abraham Bredius, whose ecstatic endorsement had launched the whole affair, refused to accept the findings, going to his grave believing that the supper at Emmaus was genuine. but the evidence was overwhelming. Han van Meegeren had told the truth. He was a fraud. The trial of Han van Meegeren began on October 29, 1947. It was a global sensation. The courtroom in Amsterdam was packed with reporters from around the world. But the nature of the trial had completely changed. The charge of collaboration, once the central issue, was quietly dropped. The prosecution now focused solely on the charges of forgery and fraud. Van Meegeren entered the courtroom, not as a reviled traitor, but as a folk hero. He was the lovable rogue, the brilliant trickster who had made a mockery of both the arrogant art world and the hated Nazi regime. He played the part to perfection, arriving in court looking dapper and confident. His defense was simple. He admitted everything. His lawyer argued that his client had been driven to forgery by a lifetime of critical neglect, and that, far from being a traitor, he had acted out of a twisted sense of patriotism. He took the stand and recounted his story, detailing his grievances against the art critics and his meticulous process. When asked why he had done it, he declared, "I did it for art." The trial lasted only 2 days. The evidence was clear, and his confession was complete. On November 12, 1947, the court found Han van Meegeren guilty of forgery and fraud. Considering his newfound popularity and the peculiar circumstances of his crime, he was given the lightest possible sentence, 1 year in prison. He never served a single day of that sentence. He returned to his home on the Keizersgracht to await his transfer to prison, enjoying his fame and giving interviews. But years of lavish living, heavy drinking, and smoking had taken their toll. Just a few weeks after his conviction, on November 26th, he suffered a heart attack and was rushed to a hospital. On December 30, 1947, Han van Meegeren died at the age of 58. He died a convicted criminal, but in the hearts of many of his countrymen, he was a hero. An opinion poll taken at the time in the Netherlands placed him as the second most popular man in the country, second only to the Prime Minister. The case of Han van Meegeren is more than just the story of a clever crime. It is a story about the nature of art, authenticity, and perception. His ultimate success lay not just in his technical skill, but in his profound understanding of human psychology. He didn't just forge a painting, he forged a story, and he exploited the desires and biases of the experts who were supposed to be immune to such deception. He knew that Dr. Bredius wanted to find a religious Vermeer, so he painted one for him. He presented the world with something it was already looking for, and in their eagerness they saw genius where there was only imitation. The anatomy of his forgery was a perfect storm of chemistry, history, and hubris. The Bakelite formula was his masterstroke, a modern solution to an ancient problem, creating an illusion of age that was, for a time, scientifically indecipherable. But just as crucial was his manipulation of provenance and his exploitation of the mystique surrounding a poorly understood artist like Vermeer. He created a product, and then he created a market eager to receive it. His crime was a mirror held up to the art world, reflecting its fallibility, its obsession with reputation, and the sometimes blurry line between an expert's eye and wishful thinking. In the aftermath, the world of art authentication was changed forever. The reliance on the subjective judgment of connoisseurs was shattered. Museums and auction houses began to lean more heavily on rigorous scientific analysis, X-rays, pigment analysis, infrared spectroscopy, to root out forgeries. Van Meegeren, in his own strange way, had forced the discipline to become more disciplined. the greatest forger of the 20th century inadvertently became a catalyst for a revolution in art forensics. He succeeded in his quest for revenge. He humiliated his critics and exposed the fallibility of the establishment he so despised. Yet there is a deep and tragic irony in his story. In his obsessive quest to prove he was a genius on par with Vermeer, he poured all of his immense talent into imitation. The one work for which he will be forever remembered, the painting that secured his fame, was not a Van Meegeren, but a lie. He had the technical skill of a master, but he used it to mimic the soul of another, leaving us to wonder what he might have created had he channeled that same passion and ingenuity into his own original art. His legacy is a complex tapestry of brilliance and bitterness, a testament to the fact that the most convincing forgeries are those that tell us a story we desperately want to believe. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.